there was a recent U.S. intelligence assessment that almost 90% of the initial Russian army that invaded Ukraine has been lost. And a lot of that has been replaced through Russia's partial mobilization and Russia's crypto mobilization effort. That has replaced those manpower losses, but those new personnel are nowhere near as trained as that initial force that invaded Ukraine. And it's kind of led to this very bifurcated Russian army. You have the very poorly trained Russian soldiers that they send out on these assaults that conduct these head-on attritional assaults and suffer very significant casualties. And then you have elements of the Russian military that are far more trained, conducting professional roles that Russian forces specifically try to conserve for critical tasks.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Riley Bailey, Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. Riley, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to come on to talk about Russia's increasing bullishness about its prospects in the war and potential weakening of Western support for Ukraine, if indeed that is the case. But first of all, I just wondered if you can give us your assessment of the latest situation on the front line.
Yeah, we can review kind of what's happening along the front line currently. Right now, Russian forces are engaged in an effort to seize the battlefield initiative in Ukraine. They're doing that in some sectors of the front. They have yet to achieve that in others. They are currently launching localized offensive efforts in eastern Ukraine, specifically in Kharkiv Oblast, trying to drive on the settlement of Kupiansk. They are also launching localized offensives in Luhansk Oblast, around Bakhmut, and then a much larger offensive effort to encircle and capture the settlement of Avdiivka and Donetsk Oblast. In all those areas, Russian forces, more or less, according to Ukrainian officials, have seized the battlefield initiative. They have yet to do so in southern Ukraine, where Ukrainian forces are still conducting assaults in western Zaporizhia Oblast, although at a tempo far smaller than what they were doing in the summer, and also in Kherson Oblast, where Ukrainian forces have established enduring positions on the left bank of the Dnipro River.
That's really interesting because if you read a lot of the coverage of the war currently, you hear the term stalemate being bandied around, and obviously General Zaluzhny was quoted as using it a while back. He says he was taken out of context a bit, but it is a word you hear, and a lot of analysts say it's sort of an inaccurate word or doesn't fully describe the picture. And from what you're saying, Riley, it does sound like if you scratch beneath the surface of it, there's a lot of movement happening.
Yeah, I wouldn't say movement. I would agree that Zaluzhny was taken out of context, or Western media seized on one phrase he stated when the overall point that he was trying to argue is that a lot of the fighting in Ukraine, the operations, have taken on a positional character in which a lot of the operations don't result in maneuver and don't result in the taking or loss of territory. And that is largely true. But we are continuing to see very large-scale operations in which Russian forces are losing extensive manpower and extensive military equipment, which do have significant operational effects.
And can Russia sustain its casualty rate at the moment, particularly in its attempts to encircle and capture Avdiivka, which seems to be a massive priority for the Kremlin?
Yeah, we've kind of seen almost this replacement level commitment of new forces to the front. And it seems that the Kremlin has almost set up the Russian force generation effort to take into account what the monthly losses are in these localized offensive efforts.
And do we know, I mean, obviously Russia doesn't publish its losses, neither does Ukraine, but do we have any estimate for what the latest monthly losses are for the Russians?
I would preface this by stating that no one has a good figure on what Russian losses throughout the war have been, specifically down to losses on a monthly basis. We do have a recent U.S. intelligence assessment that Russian forces have lost over 13,000 personnel and roughly over 200 military vehicles in their effort to capture Avdiivka. Ukrainian reporting on that puts that figure much higher. We do have open source confirmation suggesting that that 200 figure is probably likely. We also get reporting from Ukrainian officials that Russian losses around Bakhmut and Luhansk and Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast are just as high. And so it suggests that Russian losses are likely in the tens of thousands on a monthly basis.
And Riley, how would you rate Russia's chances of capturing Avdiivka over the winter months?
Currently, that doesn't look likely. There is the possibility that they continue to funnel manpower into this, that they continue to fund military equipment into this, and that we see this slow, gradual, almost meter by meter gain of territory, much like we saw around Bakhmut. That could just eventually lead to the scenario where Ukrainians make a operationally sound decision that holding Avdiivka is not worth it anymore. But we're very unlikely to see any dramatic, rapid gain of territory in which Russians are able to quickly encircle Avdiivka and capture the settlement.
Do you think there's any possibility the Ukrainians will do, as you outlined there, operationally decide to withdraw from Avdiivka because it's just not worth it anymore? I mean, you could understand it maybe on an operational level, but symbolically, that would be a huge coup for Putin, would it not?
I'm unsure of that. There was a lot of this discussion around Bakhmut, whether the Kremlin would be able to sell the capture of the city in the Donetsk Oblast to the Russian public as a great military victory. That largely did not happen. We did not see that happen. There are reasons why possibly they could do that with Avdiivka. There's been fighting around Avdiivka since 2014. They could sell the capture of Avdiivka as protecting Donetsk city. But I'm not going to assess what the Ukrainians are going to do. It's actually a policy of ours at ISW that we don't assess the likelihood of future Ukrainian operational decisions.
I fully hear what you say, so I don't know whether you can answer this, Riley, but if you're Ukraine, what constitutes a successful winter campaign, would you say?
I think at this point, holding off any Russian advances, any significantly operationally significant advances, even significant tactical advances, that's a victory. And the ability to set conditions for future significant counteroffensive operations. And I would highlight here that even though the tempo of the Ukrainian counteroffensive has dramatically slowed compared to where it was a few months ago, Ukraine is still conducting offensive operations of some type throughout southern Ukraine.
Do you think, given where we are in terms of both sides being quite well dug in their respective positions, are you expecting an increase in drone warfare and missile strikes over the next few months?
Specifically drone warfare, and we're already starting to see that. Russian and Ukrainian sources routinely talk about the importance of FPV drones along the front now. Even on an operational basis, we're seeing this. Russian forces have very much leaned in to using Shaheds. They have very much increased both how routinely they conduct Shahed strikes and the size of those strikes. What we're not seeing yet is the comparative use of missile strikes. We're not seeing it at a scale of what we saw last winter. It very much does not appear that Russian forces have launched a winter strike campaign yet. That's not to say that there isn't a strike campaign. Russian forces conduct a pretty routine and regular series of strikes throughout Ukraine, targeting specifically energy infrastructure and other critical infrastructure facilities.
That's interesting. Why do you think there is a difference between the scale of the strike campaign of last winter and this winter? Is it a supply issue? Is it that they're holding them back for future use?
It remains to be seen, but I definitely think there is a conservation effort underway here. Ukrainian officials have indicated that Russian forces have conserved a stock of missiles and other high-precision weapon systems for a strike campaign. We also have indications that Russia has gradually mobilized aspects of its defense industrial base to produce some of those missiles. This was a routine discussion through the last winter strike campaign that Russia was expending a lot of its critical missile systems and wouldn't be able to sustain a strike campaign at that tempo. It very much appears that they changed some of that. This is also why they're relying more on the Shaheds now. It's a much more cost-effective and more numerous weapon system that they can use to try to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses, also figure out where Ukrainian air defenses are. So we kind of see these mixed strikes now, a lot of Shaheds, a few missiles, specifically the Shaheds trying to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses so the missiles can strike critical targets, but we're not seeing this mass series of missile strikes. That still could happen, but so far it doesn't appear that there is going to be a prolonged winter campaign.
And how effective are the Russians being at using these Shahed drones? I think President Zelensky said over the weekend that Ukraine have shot down, I think, 104 out of 112 Shahed drones in the past week. That sounds like a pretty good air defense there from Ukraine. But of course, if you need a couple to hit key infrastructure to cause a lot of damage. So how would you rate their use of the Shaheds?
Yeah, so it's very interesting that they're leaning into the Shaheds, considering that Ukrainian air defenses have routinely been successful at shooting them down. This is not something new. I think there's almost a different operational intent for using the Shaheds. Obviously, Russian forces would be happy if they did hit their intended targets, but they're also for finding out where Ukrainian air defense systems are, for trying to overwhelm them, for trying to find new flight routes through which they both send future Shaheds, future missiles. And then there's also this grander operational objective here about continued routine strikes on very rear Ukrainian population centers keeps air defenses located in the rear of Ukraine and not on the front line.
And have we noticed any change in the way Ukraine is using drone warfare since the beginning of the conflict? I know when it began, there was a lot of talk about how Ukraine were having success with commercial drones that have been modified for use on the front line, and that Russia actually was using more expensive UAVs, so they were having to preserve somewhat more, and actually Ukraine's strategy was working better. Have we seen any shift over the past 2 years?
I think we would see both sides doubling down on that effort of trying to use commercial, cheaper, more available drones for both recon purposes along the front, to correct fires along the front, and for strike capabilities along the front. So this very tactical use of drones. I would say both Ukrainian and Russian forces have really doubled down on this effort. We're seeing much more discussion about how prevalent drone usage is in almost every sector of the front. I would say we hear a lot of discussion from Russian sources that this is one of the elements that has helped Ukrainian forces establish positions on the left bank in Kherson Oblast.
So would you say, Riley, that Ukraine is in a good position in terms of its air defenses to try and hold off the likely Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure this winter?
That remains to be seen. Last winter, we saw missile strikes ranging from 40 up to 100 missiles. It's unclear that if more missiles at a more regular pace were fired, launched at Ukraine, that air defenses would be very successful in intercepting them. There's also the possibility that mass combined strikes with a lot of Shaheds, a lot of missiles, something that we haven't really seen, huge number of Shaheds with a huge number of missiles, how Ukrainian air defenses would compete with that. And again, there is a larger operational point here that Ukraine is still having to make very hard decisions about what parts of its territory have good air defense coverage and what parts get underserved.
And just to go back to the point about the Russian casualty rates, I mean, I fully appreciate that, first of all, Putin has little regard for human life, and it doesn't particularly concern him as long as they can replace them with more troops. And I appreciate as well that, the cannon fodder strategy may indeed be a strategy and they factor that in. But there must surely come a point, whether it's in months, whether it's in years, where that strategy will catch up with the Russians, because the quality of troops on the front line, certainly compared to the quality of troops that Ukraine will have, and of course the better motivation that the Ukrainian troops have, surely there'll come a point where that will catch up with Russia.
Yeah, there's kind of two elements here. So there's a training capacity element, and then there's a morale element. The morale element's a little harder to track, a little more amorphous, but we're already seeing the results of the training combat capability element. So there was a recent U.S. intelligence assessment that almost 90% of the initial Russian army that invaded Ukraine has been lost. And a lot of that has been replaced through Russia's partial mobilization and Russia's crypto mobilization effort. That has replaced those manpower losses, but those new personnel are nowhere near as trained as that initial force that invaded Ukraine. And it's kind of led to this very bifurcated Russian army. You have the very poorly trained Russian soldiers that they send out that conduct these head-on attritional assaults and suffer very significant casualties. And then you have elements of the Russian military that are far more trained, conducting professional roles that Russian forces specifically try to conserve for critical tasks. We've seen this throughout the counteroffensive, actually, that a lot of the highly trained, relatively more elite units were responsible for repelling Ukrainian assaults and specifically counterattacking into Ukrainian assaults. That's not a task that these mobilized, poorly trained units that conduct meat assaults do.
Just wanted to ask you about the geopolitics of the war at the moment, Riley. I mean, a lot of the discussion now is over continuing Western support for Ukraine and what more support needs to be provided, especially given the impasse in Congress and America over military aid for Ukraine. And also maybe an increasingly bullish Vladimir Putin. Just sum up where you think we are in terms of the geopolitics of it. Obviously, we've got the presidential election in Russia next year. No one's in any doubt about the outcome of that, but Putin will be very keen that the optics of it work in his favor. Where do you think we are?
I definitely think there's been an inflection in the past few weeks, past few months, where Putin, at least publicly, has been much more confident. We recently saw this with his direct line forum, in which he talks with the Russian public in a highly staged event for 4 hours. And throughout 2022, 2023, Putin was very hesitant to talk about the war in public, or was only willing to talk about it in very controlled, minute settings. Here, he was willing to talk about the war much longer, much more publicly, and much more in depth than he previously has. That doesn't indicate that any of his approach to the war, any of his objectives have changed. If anything, he's very much re-stressing the initial maximalist objectives that he had when he invaded Ukraine. He's very much indicating that he thinks the West is weak, that he will be able to hold out and eventually force Ukrainian capitulation. I definitely think the relatively successful Russian defense against the counteroffensive in Western Zaporizhzhia Oblast and this apparent wavering of Western support for Ukraine has very much bolstered his viewpoint on the prospects for Russia and Ukraine.
That's interesting. So you think that he probably, in his own mind, and I mean, who really knows what's going on in Vladimir Putin's mind, but he probably genuinely does feel more bullish about Russia's chances. It's not just bluster ahead of the election.
I definitely think there is a possibility that's reflective of his own personal opinions. There's also kind of informational aspect here. There's all the bluster around the elections, but also that this is very much aimed at the West, aimed at Ukraine, to both demoralize them and to lean into existing Russian information operations that try to degrade Western support for Ukraine.
I wanted to ask you about a really interesting article the ISW released last week called The High Price of Losing Ukraine that sort of warned about what Putin might do next. Can you just tell us a bit about that piece?
Yeah, that piece was kind of designed as a starting off point for a conversation about what the costs for the West are in the event of Russian victory. And Russian victory, as Putin has described it, some of that, his maximalist objectives are kind of vague purposely so they can tack on whatever other objectives they may seek to pursue in the future. But if we take the maximalist objectives at face value, it results in the full capitulation of Ukraine, which in one shape or another would allow Russian forces to militarily occupy all of Ukraine. And in that event, we would see Russian forces be able to deploy the Russian military along NATO's entire eastern border from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean. That, as we laid out in a series of maps that suggest people view, definitely is much more threatening to the West than the current status quo, and very much more threatening to the West than in the event that Ukraine achieved full victory. That forced disposition would force the West to very much strengthen its eastern border and possibly do that as long as that threat existed, which could be indefinitely. And that incurs very high costs for the West.
And that, I suppose, tallies with what Putin said recently in an interview with Russian state TV, which was supposedly for him to play down Western fears of an assault on a NATO country, but he sort of, is part of it, threatened Finland. What exactly did he say?
Yeah, so he very much was handed this opportunity by a Russian state journalist to reassure NATO, to re-up the existing Russian information operation that tries to frame the Russian threat to the West as some invention by Western officials. And instead of just leaving it there, he very much framed Finland's NATO accession as the reason why Russian forces are reforming the Leningrad military district, which will be responsible for the border with Finland, and stated that there will be problems with Finland because of its NATO accession. And we're actually seeing this right now. The Russian military has long-term restructuring and expansion efforts that it's trying to pursue, and one of that is splitting the Western military district into the Leningrad and Moscow military districts. The Western military district is responsible for the area along Russia's border with NATO, and they're splitting that military district so that they can kind of balance the force requirements in Ukraine with still being able to posture against NATO. And so the fact that he specifically referenced this new military district or this reformed military district specifically highlights that intent.
I mean, do you think, were he to achieve his objectives in Ukraine, do you think that Finland might be the next area of conflict, or do you think he would prioritize the Baltic states?
I'm not going to try to forecast that far ahead. I definitely think that Russian officials routinely threaten their neighbors, routinely threaten former Soviet countries. And increasingly, the Kremlin is doubling down on this expansionist rhetoric that should be threatening to any of Russia's neighbors. They're increasingly referencing this very strange conception of sovereignty in which it's very unclear who falls under Russian protection. There's these weird definitions of what is an ethnic Russian that falsely include Russians, Ukrainians. There is the idea of the Ruski Mir, which includes a whole bunch of ethnic groups that only connection is that they were once ruled by the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, and posits that Russia has both the right and the duty to protect these groups. They're very much giving the Kremlin carte blanche to interfere in the affairs of their neighbors and to impose the Kremlin's will upon them.
I mean, just the fact that they are returning to that language is probably a concerning sign for the West, because we heard a lot of that discussion from Russia at the start of the full-scale invasion. We haven't seemed to have heard so much of it in the last couple of years, but now it's back, it seems.
Yes, very much so. I would say in the past few weeks, we've seen a very concerted effort on the part of Putin, on the part of the Kremlin, a lot of Russian officials returning to this expansionist rhetoric, specifically in Ukraine, but like also on a wider scale.
I suppose the elephant in the room here is what happens in the US presidential election in under a year now. To what extent do you think Putin's entire strategy for this war is now linked to a victory for Donald Trump?
I would say that the war in Ukraine is very strategically important for Russia, to the point that I don't think they would rest that effort just on something that's very variable like that. I definitely think there is a thought in the Kremlin that potentially leaders in the West, specifically the United States, could come to power that would not be as enthusiastic in their support for Ukraine. I definitely think there is a thought that we just might need to hold out for a second until that comes to pass, or that doesn't come to pass, and then we can make a future decision going forward from that point. But I would say that that is not the crux upon which the entire Russian effort in Ukraine rests right now.
And if you're Russia, in terms of what you want to see happen with NATO, I mean, presumably, ideally, they'd want to see NATO completely destroyed, but on a more realistic level, are they hoping for an end to the open door policy for new members? Are they hoping for an assurance that Ukraine will never be allowed to join the alliance? What do you think Putin thinks is realistic?
There is whatever he thinks is realistic, but there is also what he's committed to. And even what he thinks is realistically achievable for Russia in the near term, he is going to continue pursuing that maximalist objective. He has always expressed that throughout the war, and has always expressed his intent towards NATO for much of his presidency. That for Ukraine, his objectives include these amorphous terms: denazification and demilitarization, which are code words. Denazification is a code word for regime change, in which the Kremlin gets to replace the entire Ukrainian government with whatever is acceptable to the Kremlin. Demilitarization is some scale of reducing Ukrainian military capabilities to the point where it could not defend itself, and the Kremlin could impose its will on Ukraine whenever it deemed fit. There is also a third goal in Ukraine, stated overarching goal in Ukraine, that is Ukraine's neutral status, which would preclude Ukraine from joining NATO, from joining the EU. That would require changes to Ukraine's constitution, and that neutral status is part of the wider series of objectives, Russian objectives beyond Ukraine, that ultimately aim to weaken the NATO alliance. We saw this with the security guarantees that the Kremlin asked for before the full-scale invasion, which asked for a moratorium on NATO expansion, rolling NATO back to its 1997 borders, preventing NATO from placing strike weapons close to Russia. Specifically, that moratorium on NATO expansion, the open door policy, would require NATO to change its charter, which most likely would require some negotiation and ratification of the treaty. And all of that is aimed at weakening the alliance, so that it's both a completely different type of alliance, so that it's structurally no longer the same, ideologically no longer the same, and ultimately that's all aimed at making sure that NATO can't compete with Russia and that it can't impede upon its path to trying to seek its strategic objectives, whatever those may be. That might be territorial conquest, as we're seeing in Ukraine, or that might be an effort to establish dominance over whatever countries fall in what it considers to be its sphere of influence.
And just to round things off, Riley, as we enter 2024, what specifically will you be looking out for?
I definitely think I will be looking out for how a lot of the localized Russian offensive efforts currently ongoing develop. That's very important, specifically for when Ukraine will be able to kind of regather, reconstitute, and launch larger counteroffensive operations. We're seeing them set conditions for those counteroffensive operations, but a lot of that's going to depend on how they're also having to respond to these offensive operations, these Russian offensive operations. Right now, a lot of those Russian offensive operations are limited in scope. It is possible that Russian forces will try to funnel more manpower, more equipment, and try to seek more operationally significant goals. That's not clear yet. So definitely kind of trying to keep track of the operations that we're seeing on the ground, I think, is always important to keep an eye out for.
Riley, really appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.